It's Friday. We nearly made it. Thanks for being here and thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I think it's really important for us all to get into a room every now and then and talk about all the challenges that we're seeing. I think we have a lot in common in that way more than we necessarily think. So, as Tyler mentioned, I am the publishing editor at AdWeek, and I spend my day talking to fine people such as yourselves, talking about the publishing industry and any sort of pain points you may or may not be seeing. They a lot of times try to turn into therapy sessions. I think a lot of us really have the same complaints. Again, why it's really important for us to be in the same room. All that being said, though, too, I think we are going about these in different ways. We have our different strategies. And so it's important to keep in mind that we're all not going to be in the same space and we're all not going to have the same solutions to all of our issues. So I did the presentation is pretty wide ranging. As I mentioned, my beat is media, which is basically everything. But I really focus on digital and traditional media publications as well as the podcasting space. And I think it's a good way to approach covering our industry just because it is so wide ranging. I'm really able to touch on all different types of trends. So we had a really, really busy media news week, especially with the different mergers and acquisitions announced. I think it means a lot of consolidation for our industry moving forward into 2020 and beyond. We're seeing a lot of publishers bring their creativity in-house to speak a little bit better to the audiences they reach and what those conversations look like with advertisers. 2020 is a wide open space in terms of advertising dollars. OTT, one of my favorite words, talking about the media industry and where we're moving there. We're going to have more players, obviously, coming online within the rest of this year and into next. So it'll be interesting to see how that fits into our ecosystem. All of this to say, though, at some point, consumers are going to tap out on the number of subscriptions they're willing to take on any given month, especially when you take into consideration the OTT players that are already on in the industry and have already been released. I talk with publishers a lot about diversifying revenue streams and what that looks like. So I'll touch a little bit on that. And then, of course, working with platforms and what that looks like for everyone. So before we talk about the trends that I have seen so far this year, I think it's important to kind of set the stage and talk about where we entered at the beginning of this year. We saw a lot of the big magazine industries, the three big publishing houses, wind down some of their print titles. And they had different strategies when they did that, but most of them started by making a splashy announcement online and then slowing it down to consumers. But funny enough, each of these publishing houses then released special interest publications, which are the magazines that you see specifically on newsstands. So it's kind of an interesting look at how they are moving away from a subscription based model and toward the newsstand as they rely more on advertising dollars and that higher cover price and are expecting consumers to pay for that. In terms of the digital media entities, we're seeing VC funding dry up. So we're not having those big digital media boom that we saw in the early 2000s, in the mid 2000s. As that media funding dries up, it'll be interesting to see, as I mentioned, who merges and who consolidates and how that space looks going forward. And then can't forget also the challenged local news environment that we're facing now as the news cycle becomes more and more important to cover. Those resources aren't necessarily being allocated at the local level. So to get into it, this week, and this is actually dated because even though it's a few days old, we already had another merger announced in that time. But so we have New York Media and Vox Media, as well as Vice Media and Refinery, and then Group 9 and Pop Sugar announced that they were merging this week as well. So I think it's important to keep in mind how these different resources are going to look going into the new year. A lot of these mergers happened because they can share resources. They can share their ad sales team. They can be and offer better offerings to advertisers in-house. Every example is different, but we have been in this space in a while. I mean, in the early 90s, we saw a ton of media mergers, and it seems like because everything is a cycle in this lovely industry of ours, we're back in that space. Bustle is a great example of someone who's really taken advantage of a lot of fire sales, you could say, for some of these media digital tiles. Gawker.com, which they acquired and is now part of the portfolio, was acquired for less than $1 million, as were a lot of these different titles that they now have in this portfolio. But then they can posture themselves as having this massive reach, and they can use the resources that they inherited from these different brands to really go up against those big dollars that are going to the platforms or are going to some of their competitors. An example like Bustle is really interesting too, because they have pieced together what they've acquired and are now using those resources across brands. So a brand like Mike, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but was really looking to needed a buyer to keep the lights on. They went and took the branded content team, and now they have a branded content team that goes up against any sort of the large publishers now, because they've been able to use those resources and apply it to the entire audience within the portfolio. And working with publishers on creative content is really interesting too when you think about what these mergers look like. As I mentioned, because these resources are now shared across brands, these publishers can go to advertisers and talk about really specific figures on what their audience look like and give really specific data, which media buyers are obviously really interested in. You're seeing this across the big publications. The Washington Post has its own brand studio, as does the Journal, as does the Times. A lot of these digital media companies have in-house studios that are really important for advertisers. Here's an example that and you can take a look at online if you'd like to play around with it. But this came from the Washington Post brand studio. If you open up the web page and play around with it kind of takes you into an airport scenario, and it shows you different points where a data hacker might be able to steal your information. And so you scroll down the website, and information pops up as you scroll down, and you can click throughout the room and see where your data might be at risk. But I think what's important about this project is that they use technology that was then shared with the editorial newsroom, and they kept church and state different. But because the brand studio had the resources and the advertiser backing this sort of innovation, they were able to share that then with the editorial newsroom and talk about projects that might fit under that hard news environment. 2020 is happening. Who's excited? A lot of sites saw a Trump bump editorially, so they got a lot of big traffic to their sites. And so going in post 2016 and talking about where they were going to share those resources was really interesting. I think a lot of publishers now are bracing for something similar to happen in 2020. When you're also thinking about 2020, there are going to be a lot of ad dollars being spent in this election cycle. There already have been. They're projecting $6 billion to be spent under this cycle, and 20% of that chunk is just allocated for digital spending. So there's a really big opportunity here for these news sites, specifically to provide those opportunities for advertisers, especially if you're a site that can offer those brand safe environments that advertisers are really seeking right now. Okay, OTT. I think this is a really interesting space for the media industry to evolve, and I'd love to hear from a lot of you afterward about how you're in this space. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, over-the-top devices. So, those are services like your Hulus, your Rokus, your Netflixes that you're gonna access on your TV sets or on mobile, depending on how you consume media. So new to the stage this year, we're gonna have Disney Plus, HBO Max, Peacock, Apple TV Plus, Disney, Quibi, BET Plus. There's a slew of them, and they start as cheap as $5 per month. So when we're thinking about our own media diets, and if you're a publisher thinking about what consumers might be willing to pay for, know that this space is going to get even more crowded. As I mentioned already on the market, you have your Hulus, your HBO Go's, your Netflixes, your Showtime, your Amazon Primes, and interestingly, they all have different ad models. So some of them are subscription based, or you have a player like Hulu who offers both. So depending on what you want. Disney is a really big player to watch in this space because they have Disney Plus, which will be their OTT offering, ESPN Plus, which is their sports streaming channel, and then they also have a really large stake in Hulu. So they kind of have arms in all of these different areas, and definitely a player that will be formidable for these folks to go up to. It's interesting how individual newsrooms are kind of dipping their toe in the waters and trying to get into the game. Just to give you two examples, Condé Nast has launched their standalone 3 OTT channels across 3 brands, GQ, Wired, and Bon Appetit. And so you can go home and pull up your Roku or your Apple TV and download specifically one of these channels. The rollout of this information is kind of interesting. So they formatted these different shows and have produced these shows for YouTube and watched the success of how those shows performed, and then decided based on those engagement figures which they would then go and develop for their OTT channel. Compare that with someone like Bloomberg, who has just improved the video quality of what they're able to offer, and this lives on their site just like this. So they're watching to see how consumers respond and what advertisers think about that before they start shopping it specifically to some of these different OTT players. All right, just a show of hands, how many of you have some of these so-called OTT services, whether it's Hulu or Netflix or HBO? Okay, great. And then raise your hand if you have 2 or more of those. Okay, great. How many of you have 5 or more? Oh my gosh, wow. Impressive, impressive. Um, so they say that 2 is the magic number for subscription services, which is a really low number considering the type of competition that is gonna be out on this landscape. And I think what's really important for publishers to think about is where OTT fits into our media diet. Is it additive? Is it complementary? If I get the Disney Plus, does that mean I'm going to take away my Washington Post subscription? So as our industry starts depending more on subscribers and more on consumers paying for content, it'll be interesting to take a look and see how that changes. Diversifying revenue streams. So, as I mentioned, I cover a lot of publishers and the space at large, which is helpful in determining what kind of trends we're seeing. So, these are pictures from events that have been put on by what you would call traditional and digital publications within the last year. We have an example like Pop Sugar's Playground. Or we have Bustle's Rule Breakers, which we had Lizzo performing. And then in the center here, we had the NYT and New York Times Food Festival, which they launched for the first time last week. So as these titles and as you think about how you're interacting with consumers going into the rest of the year and beyond, publishers are really leaning into the event space to sort of fill those gaps and work with advertisers in new and different ways. Working with platforms, as you know, is crucial. Um, one in particular place I think is really interesting is Facebook Watch and what different publishers have done with that platform. Um, I have 2 opposite really extremes. I talked a little bit about Mike and how they were acquired by Bustle there at the last minute. It was because that they bet too big on Facebook Watch. They invested the rest of their resources in ensuring that their programming on this platform would do well, and Facebook pulled the deal, and so it didn't end up being an opportunity for them that worked out. On the opposite side of the coin, we have a publisher like Business Insider who has really specialized in those quick hit videos that will show up in your Facebook feeds and your other social feeds. And they've packaged that and created a daily news show and has hired some really big producers from the big networks to come in and offer that expertise. But this is one of the biggest success stories out of the Facebook Watch program and the publishers involved. As I said in the beginning, it's important to keep in mind that everyone is going to have their own pathway to success. You can't all apply all these models everywhere. We're not all a one size fits all, even though there is a lot of opportunity within this industry. It's important to keep in mind that you're going to have your own path. Any questions? Here's my Twitter if you want to follow up afterward, or my email. But as I mentioned, I'm a reporter too, so happy to speak on what sort of trends we're seeing within our own newsroom, or because I cover the media industry too, happy to talk about that. Any questions? Yeah. So this over the top thing, is this something and or is it something that publishers, say, certain small publishers could take a look at something or opportunity out there for us? Yeah, I think there are ways to enter the over the top landscape. There are small steps you can take, like you improving your video quality, um, thinking about the kind of content that might be appealing on video for your readers. I think it would be a big space to get into if you don't have the resources to necessarily allocate. To go up against a Condé Nast would be really difficult. But I think that if you have a niche audience who isn't getting this type of content in other places, it could be a good way to stand out. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, so especially when it comes to the platforms and the decisions they make in their algorithm, it's easier for a large publisher to sort of soften that blow and to have the resources to work around those things. I think it's especially concerning for the local news industry who doesn't have the resources actually to kind of pivot in that way. So I think you're hearing the most pain points coming out of the local industry and the smaller publishers. And I think that'll really only worsen as these tweaks happen.
Think it's a good time to sell if you're a small independent publisher now or wait
That's a great question. We should probably all go buy lottery tickets if I had the right answer. I think the pathway for everyone is different. I think if you are a publisher who has a similar audience as an owner who might be able to capitalize on that, and if you are in need of combining resources in that way, I think a merger is a good way to do that. I think it's important, you know, in thinking about what the economy looks like and beyond, if this is a way to sustain yourself and to ensure your profitability, it might be an option.
Hi,
Yeah.
Sarah. Along with OTT, we hear about CTV. Do you know the clear definition between the two?
Yeah. So, connected TV versus over the top devices. Connected TV would be something that requires just a digital box, whereas OTT would be on all devices that you would consume, like an app almost. So, something that you could download on your phone versus something that you would need to stream video on your connected device through the internet.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Mhm. I think that's a great point that you bring up, though. There's so much nuance and gray area in our industry that sometimes we just need to get in the same room and talk about what our definitions are, publisher per publisher. Because a lot of my conversations with sources have to be rudimentary in that respect. Tell me what a video view looks like to you. How do you define that? Our industry is terrible in that way and not having consistency. Yeah.
So if you're having success on YouTube or video that are fairly good in OT,
I th I think that's a good place to start. I don't wanna understate the investment that would be required to launch a full-blown OTT channel. Um, if you're a smaller publisher, I would really focus on expanding that YouTube presence or an Instagram presence and experimenting with what video looks like there before really even thinking about OTT, which just from a scale perspective is gonna be a massive lift. Any other questions? I'm around later too if anything, pops up between then. Alright. Thank you.